I wanted to share a couple of slides about youth and carjacking today. First of all, I just want to orient us to what we mean when we're talking about carjacking. In Illinois, the statute is called vehicular hijacking. And the word carjacking is actually sort of new. It came to rise during the juvenile super predator scare of the 80s and 90s that everyone has been referring to as the bad old days for criminal justice policy in general. It is a kind of robbery, right? You could be robbed, which is a taking by the threat or use of force for your wallet or for your watch or for your car keys. When it's your car keys or your entire vehicle, we call it carjacking. And that colloquial term kind of obscures a broad range of behavior. Sometimes it can be something on the more minor end, which is your keys are in your car at the gas pump and you're pumping the gas, someone gets in the car and drives away with your car, all the way to, you are actually threatened with very pointed harm at gunpoint and may be injured. So there's a wide range of behavior that this kind of robbery can encompass. It doesn't have to have, but it can have a weapon, injury, physical contact, a verbal threat. You don't have to be inside of your car for it to be considered a carjacking necessarily. So I just wanted to make sure we all understand that this is one variant of robbery. So what does that mean in terms of what's been happening lately? Here's data for the last few years. You've been maybe hearing a lot that police brutality protests in 2020 have changed policing so significantly that this is causing some sort of crime surge. Meanwhile, robbery, theft, and burglary are at their lowest in 5 years. And car theft without a person present did not have an incredible spike. It went up, but not extraordinarily. So when we take carjackings increase, the spike in vehicular hijackings into context, we can see that there were 21,567 fewer robberies, thefts, car thefts, and burglaries. All of this data I need to stop and specify, and I apologize for this. All of this is for the city of Chicago. I unfortunately don't have up-to-date state information, so it may be different around the state. This is data, all of this particular to the city of Chicago, but I think some of the things that we'll be talking about are very true statewide. So 21,000 fewer robberies and other crimes in general in the city of Chicago, 813 additional vehicular hijackings in the calendar year 2020. When we look just at types of robbery, we can see that we have, I just want to make sure that I'm not, okay. I want to make sure somebody's not trying to get my attention to say that they can't hear me. There is a net increase of 125 robberies of this type as compared to 2019. And when compared to back in 2016, there's a net decrease of 4,000 robberies citywide. Now, I would pause and ask why it is that we're hearing news stories and communications from the Chicago Police Department that concern this uptick in the dark blue line at the bottom, but we aren't seeing comparative coverage of the very large decrease of this light blue line at the top. There are no crime is down headlines that people are sharing on social media. There are no armed robbery is disappearing at a marked rate stories that are circulating. And I'm sorry to say that that's so. I know that it would be easier to make wise public safety policy if that were the case, but that is not the environment that we live in. To the extent that communicating back information to your constituents is helpful, I'm happy to help provide and gather those statistics. I also think that those are the sorts of things that it's maybe easier for you to receive back from law enforcement than it might be for someone like me. So I can help you to craft a data request if any of you are interested in that. Of the 2020 carjackings, about 1 in 3 were not aggravated for any reason. That means that they didn't have any kind of a weapon, much less a gun, and there wasn't a protected class of victim. That's another way that a vehicular hijacking could become aggravated, and that means, for instance, that there's a senior citizen involved or a young child in the car. And when we look at police behavior in response to this carjacking crime, there's an interesting thing that happens when we talk about the number of arrests versus the number of incidents that have an arrest associated with them. And that's because this type of robbery is best done in a group. It's important to be able to approach fast if the victim is in or near a vehicle. That means you need one vehicle, and then you need someone to drive two vehicles away. So at minimum, it's useful to have two people. Many times, of course, the amount of force that you're able to show, surprising the person who's the victim of the crime, is helpful. So a group of 3 to 5 people are often involved. That means that when people are arrested for carjackings or vehicular hijackings, that's not necessarily indicative of how often these cases are actually being solved by police. So when you hear police statistics talking about the number of arrests, and it sounds very high, I just want to point out that of the 1,400 plus incidents in 2020, 62 of them so far are associated with any kind of an arrest of anyone. It's really important for us to look at how frequently these cases are cleared, because it's easy to relocate where people perceive a lack of accountability for an offense from getting caught for an offense to deeper in the criminal process, right? So something that might be happening in court or with a prosecutor or with a judge, something that's happening during sentencing, people perceive a lack of accountability for this type of crime as happening at the county or state level, when perhaps it's happening more at the local level in Chicago. I want to talk specifically about young people because there has been a lot of concentration on the fact that young people are committing this crime in great numbers. Now, I want to point out that there were an average of 32 youth arrested in the city of Chicago in 2020, more than in an average year, and 9 additional youth arrested for a kind of vehicular hijacking that has a gun involved. So I would ask you if the kind of coverage that you're seeing about increased youth crime matches this extra 9 youth arrested with, for a crime that involved a gun, or 32 in all. And again, in 1,354 cases, no arrest was made. I find that when officials are focusing blame specifically on young people, we see this in issue after issue, and it certainly was the case in the 80s and beyond. It might be that they are trying to blame the kids of today for a system, adult policy failure, or series of failures. And maybe it's not the failures of their own department necessarily, but more intransigent social problems that we all bear a share of responsibility for. Nevertheless, when we're talking about young people, they are very much not in control of the environment in which they live, are born into, grow up in, the sort of resources that they have. And so when we're looking at what's causing an uptick one year or a decrease in another in youth crime, small as it may be, it's important to think about the ways that the systems surrounding those youth are supporting or failing to support their success. I just thought that this was an interesting quote to show a narrative that I think we've all heard. Police records show the great majority of car thefts to have been committed by boys under 18 years of age. Their youth saves them from the penitentiary, and they apparently pay little attention to the moderate punishment inflicted by the juvenile court. The situation, however, has become so serious that drastic action must be taken. And I want to point out that is not a typo. That was 1919 and not 2019 that an editorial board in Salt Lake City made that comment. I think that the young people of Chicago, in particular, Black young people who are predominantly blamed for this increase in crime, deserve better than rhetoric that is a century old plus. So when we look at what we are all experiencing, which is very reasonable fears about a crime increase that is happening, what are the things that might be driving it? What are the things that we can do about it? And so this is just a beginning slide to get us thinking about the solutions. I think Mr. Jackson's solutions about gun violence that he brought up earlier are exactly on point. But when we're talking specifically about the incidents of carjacking, I think we can see how this plays out across the country, right? In Philadelphia last month, they had a threefold increase in carjackings, 150% in New Orleans last year, big increase in Oakland last year. The point is that this is not a Chicago issue. It is a national issue, and law enforcement around the country has been talking about the fact that this is likely related to the pandemic. Now, to the extent that young people are overrepresented in this type of offense, young people and cars have gone together since the invention of the car. And it is primarily a young person's type of offense to so thoroughly ignore the huge risk that is involved when you're taking by violence someone's, in some cases, primary asset, right? Many people, their car is their biggest form of wealth. It's vital to their livelihood. And so they're likely to try to defend it, even though that defense isn't necessarily lawful, with violence. So it's important to, an adult would think about those sorts of things when thinking about whether to engage in this type of crime. When young people see the type of freedom and power that is represented by being able to be in a vehicle, those thoughts don't necessarily engage in the same way. And so youth are often overrepresented in this crime category. However, there is also, we talked about the decrease in armed robbery that was happening and the increase of carjacking specifically that is happening, it's important to think about the pandemic in two ways. One is we're still not sure that it is an increase in youth per se. We see that that conjecture is based on a pretty small number of youth, and youth are pretty easy comparatively to catch when they've committed an offense. I heard the superintendent of police say on the radio the other day, one young person was arrested after he hopped in the car and tried to drive it away and realized he wasn't able to drive an automatic transmission, a manual transmission. He only knew how to drive automatic and he was caught right away. I think that really illustrates the kind of pre-planning or lack thereof that happens with a lot of this type of crime for young people in particular. So if you're only making an arrest in a small number of cases, young people are likely to be overrepresented in that group. Nevertheless, there is perhaps a nexus between the conditions that young people are experiencing right now during this historic moment, where their generation is being put under stress that has not happened in several generations, right? Not only are their connections to school in many cases disrupted and the social services and supports that are often delivered through school, but many people in Illinois may not be aware that a lot of young people aged 16 to 24 were left out of the stimulus packages from the federal government that had passed so far. If you're claimed as a dependent on someone else's tax return, you're actually not eligible over the age of 16 for the previous stimulus checks to receive any support. And so young people's families are under extreme pressure, even given the pressure that everyone is under during pandemic, young people's families are under even more pressure. The other thing that may be impacting this increase in vehicular hijacking is not necessarily a crime related to young people at all, which is if armed robbery is going down around the city, that's likely in 2020, in part because there's fewer people on the street. There's fewer people on the CTA. There's fewer people in retail stores running the cash register. Those are types of settings where robberies are much more frequent, but harder to accomplish given the social distancing that we've all been doing. There's fewer people who are potential victims of crime. And so some of that crime is literally relocated, potentially, to catching someone while they're in their car and accomplishing a robbery that way. It's important when we're thinking about what young people's stress is like, that we think about their once-in-a-generation mental health crisis. This is true for people of all ages, but it is so true for young people who really need the connection of their peers at this time. People learn and develop not only by making mistakes and doing better, but also by being around people their own age. We are all hardwired at this age to cling to our friends and it's part of the detachment from your family and attachment into broader society. And it's what makes you a good citizen as an adult, is to be extremely attached to your broader community. This is the time in adolescence when those connections are forming. And this is the time when it's so important that the response that we give to young people is one that increases rather than decreases their attachment to their broader community. So when we're talking about solutions to whether it's specifically carjacking offenses that are committed by young people or offenses by young people more generally, it's important that they're age appropriate, keep them connected and not disenfranchised and not embittered. But you can hold a young person accountable for their actions, as I hope all of you were when you were younger, in a way that is serious and meaningful, but does not damage or destroy, right? That's the goal that everybody has for their own kids. It's the goal that they had for their own childhood, whether it was met or not. And it's really important. Also, we need to talk about how many guns are available in Chicago. That is a constant concern. We'll save that mostly for another day. Increasing funding for violence reduction programs. Mr. Jackson talked about that quite a bit, and it's important. Increased state funding is important. I know that the budget crisis is huge. Looking at the state budget, I see three main categories that most state funds seem to go toward. And I would ask you whether a pandemic is the time to cut back on social services, healthcare services, education, or criminal justice responses that we have talked about today are not the most effective, right? Of those options, I think that the latter category is the one where we could scale back our investment so that we have more funds, more energy, and more investment available to these other buckets. Here in the city of Chicago, the funding for violence prevention has been increased. Unfortunately, it hasn't been increased nearly to where it should be. Advocates had said that $50 million would be the bare minimum required to start really taking violence as a public health issue seriously. The latest budget that just passed funded it at $36 million. And in fact, in order to create some truly transformative work at the city level, $150 million had been asked for by many advocates. So just to put those numbers in perspective, it's excellent that CJA has given out grants, that there's the R3 money that's coming out, that there's violence reduction funding that's happening, but the scale that's needed is much bigger than has been happening. I also think, everyone that has been speaking, myself very much included and guilty, is an adult. And we have to ask young people what they need, and we have to ask them what they want. Both of those questions are important if what we want is to change their behavior. I just put down an idea that we've been talking about in my office. Our students have researched programs about, that unfortunately are paused currently at Chicago Public Schools about, auto shop, teaching young teenagers how to repair cars, maybe get into cars as a career. They're drawn to them, and there's healthy ways to channel this interest of theirs. And I think that if young people had a clear concept of a path to car ownership, it would change the ability to make wiser decisions in today. It's just one example. I also think it's incumbent upon us all to speak responsibly to and about teens. And here I want to talk about deterrence for just one moment before I close. I have been hearing a lot of very concerning rhetoric that there is no punishment for carjacking, that juvenile court is a slap on the wrist, that it does nothing, that young people are just coddled and sent on their way, that you can get away with anything in the city of Chicago in particular, but this is rhetoric that definitely exists around the entire state. Think about what those messages do when young people hear them. They're not true, so there's that. But think about if we believe that deterrence is a factor for young people at all, and it is hard to deter a teenager in the moment But the thing that is most likely to persuade them to make a wiser choice is a perception that they will be caught. It's not how long they're going to be served. It's not how long they're likely to, be locked away. And it's not whether they go to adult court. What's likely to change their calculation to commit a crime is whether they're caught. And that can mean many different things. Like Kathy mentioned at the outset, it could be getting caught by your family, your community, yes, law enforcement. But when you hear nothing from public officials, but that there is no getting caught, or if you are caught, you won't be punished, I think those are really contrary to public health messages that we need to be explaining to young people. Carjacking is a very serious offense. Vehicular hijacking in the state of Illinois carries a minimum of 15 years if it's done with a handgun. And that's mandatory prison time, regardless of how old you are if you are tried as an adult. So it's important that we treat young people in not only a way that is developmentally appropriate, but that we communicate in a way that is developmentally appropriate about the severity of this offense, which may not seem that severe to them, but we all obviously take very seriously. I'll close there.